Now, there was, of course, one other major outcome from the NATO summit.
I don't want to deal with them anymore. They're scum. You know what scum is? They're scum. They're sick people. They're led by sick people. And they're vicious, violent people. And if they had a nuclear weapon, they'd use it. As far as I'm concerned, it's over. They're liars. They're cheats. They're sick people.
Trump left Turkey on the old Air Force One instead of his new Qatari-donated plane, a security precaution taken due to renewed hostilities with Iran. As of this morning, the US-Iran ceasefire has effectively collapsed, and the two sides have exchanged strikes for a second consecutive day. Both sides blame the other for the breakdown, and across news media, there is sharp divergence over who was the key provocateur. So here's the timeline. On Tuesday, two tankers, one Qatari, the other Saudi, were struck by projectiles in the Strait of Hormuz. Qatar accused Iran. US CENTCOM responded by striking around 80 Iranian targets. Iranian state media reported 8 military casualties. Simultaneously, the US Treasury reimposed sanctions less than 3 weeks after the deal was signed. Iran's IRGC responded overnight, targeting 85 US military sites in Bahrain and Kuwait. And then on Wednesday, Trump told NATO the Memorandum of Understanding was over and the Iranian government was scum. He threatened to reimpose the naval blockade and strike Iran's electricity and water plants. 1 hour later, the US launched the largest wave of attacks, hitting the cities of Iran Shah, Bandar Abbas, Kanarak, Chabar, Bashir, and Ak-Kala. Markets reacted sharply. Brent crude rose to around $78 a barrel. Even before the US strikes, divisions were emerging within Iran's leadership between those who favor negotiation with Washington and hardliners who oppose a deal. The 6-day funeral of late Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei saw imagery openly wishing harm on the US President Donald Trump. And Washington is also divided between peace and war, with little to show from the first 3 months of fire and stagnant negotiations ever since. What are they still hoping to gain? Will they gain it? And what are their options besides war? I'm joined now by US political scientist and professor at the Harvard Kennedy School, Stephen M Walt. Stephen, welcome to MEE Live. It's great to have you. Can you just explain to us, how is it that Iran is continually able to stand up to the US, particularly in the Strait of Hormuz, despite the US clearly being the superior military power?
Well, it's primarily because, first of all, this is an existential danger for Iran. They see this as a struggle for survival, whereas for the United States, it was a war of choice from the very beginning. It was not a war where American vital interests were really engaged, and that means Iran's willing to bear enormous pain and pay an enormous price to stay in the fight. The second reason, of course, is the United States actually has limited military options here. It can't invade Iran because it would take enormous casualties if it did that. It can't shut off Iran's ability to threaten shipping in the Straits of Hormuz. If we could do that, we would have done that already. So there are real limits here. And in fact, the Trump administration is, I think, running out of targets. They can now start attacking civilian infrastructure and even civilians themselves in Iran, but that would be a war crime as well. So in a sense, America, despite its enormous military advantage, has real limits here in terms of the actual leverage. And then finally, add to that the fact that the United States, and especially President Trump, is worried about the economic consequences of higher energy prices, on what that means for the midterm elections in November. So his incentive to try and keep this under control, try and limit this, and eventually get the strait open is, I think, higher than Iran's. For all those reasons, the United States doesn't have the leverage you might think it would, given the disparity in each side's capabilities.
What does this tell us about the strategic value of Trump returning to war and indeed initiating war in the first place?
Well, I think it's pretty clear that he's just reacting to events. I mean, his behavior and his statements throughout the war have been incredibly erratic. Sometimes he has called the Iranian leadership reasonable and says they want a deal. And you showed the clip of him at the NATO summit calling them scum and saying they're very bad people and that they're liars as well. So if you're the Iranians, you can't really take anything the president says seriously because he's been all over the map there. The second problem here is there is zero trust between these two governments, especially on the Iranian side. Remember that this war began with Israel and the United States killing most of Iran's senior leaders. That is not exactly the way you encourage confidence. And Iran is in a position where they're not going to believe any American promises unless they're really convinced the United States is going to stick to them. And the best way for Iran to do that, I think, in their minds, is to make sure that the United States pays a large price for this war and therefore learns never to do this sort of thing again. And that means they're going to drive a very hard bargain, and they're going to want a lot of buy-in from other countries as well before they're going to declare the war ultimately over.
There's a long-running debate about how much US policy towards Iran is driven by Netanyahu and by Israeli lobbying in Washington. How would you characterize that influence, and where do people get it wrong?
Well, that influence has been extraordinary in this particular case. I mean, we know, I think, quite clearly that President Trump was persuaded to start the war after a long briefing that he got in the White House from Prime Minister Netanyahu, basically convincing him that it was going to be easy, that the Iranian regime would collapse quickly, and this would be a great strategic victory. So in that sense, Israel, I think, was quite critical to this. And second, yes, the pro-Israeli lobby in the United States, especially the hardline parts of that lobby, had been pushing for a war with Iran for a long time and building the case that this was absolutely vital for the United States as well, which I think has never actually been true. It is important, and this is the place where people get it wrong, it is important to recognize that not every pro-Israel organization supported the war. For example, J Street came out immediately with a statement condemning the war because I think they correctly understood this was not the way to solve these problems as well. So when you are hoping to attribute responsibility for the war, you want to be very careful to focus only on those people who actively pushed for it and not the people who were skeptical or who opposed it.
And of course, US has a long-standing tradition of there being a very strong domestic pro-war voice in Washington. The same voices who championed the Iraq War were prominent advocates for this one, and they received just as much platforming with no accountability for their historic errors. This is, as you argue, in foreign policy. Why does the US foreign policy establishment, why does the US media keep listening to people if they keep getting it wrong?
That's an extraordinarily good question. I mean, in the American elite, there has not been a lot of accountability in the past. People who have failed repeatedly in policy positions can get reappointed. It's a very self-protective elite in a variety of ways. And I think a lot of media figures, media organizations, rely on the same familiar names in reporters' Rolodexes or address books. And they repeatedly want to try and show that they listen to both sides. So people who have been advocating war for a long time still get paid attention to, even when the wars they've advocated for go very badly. It's, I think, a huge problem for the United States that we can't hold our public officials to greater account. And this, I think, is just another example of the consequences of that.
If we do consider seriously the reasons for going to war in the first place, if the result is some kind of nuclear agreement, would that at least be a success worth the cost?
It's almost certainly not worth the cost, because remember, we had a good nuclear agreement with Iran before, and Donald Trump tore it up during his first term. We're not going to get a deal with Iran going forward that's substantially different from that. And the cost has been enormous. Americans have paid, over $500 billion in excess energy costs already. The Trump administration is asking for $70 billion more to pay the direct costs of the war. Other economies around the world have been affected by this in lots of ways due to the higher energy prices, loss of fertilizer, etc. So to expend all of those costs, and by the way, to let Iran demonstrate that it has the capacity to control the Strait of Hormuz going forward, all of that is on the cost side, and to basically go back to an agreement that's very similar to the one that we had carefully negotiated under President Obama is not what I would call a strategic victory.
Okay, so what alternatives are there to resuming warfare, given the ongoing confrontation in the Strait of Hormuz? If you were advising the White House this week, what off-ramp would you propose to Trump?
The off-ramp here is that we have to recognize we made a big mistake, that we shouldn't have gone to war in the first place. And when you make a big mistake, you don't get out of it without paying a substantial price. The United States needs to establish a reasonable regime for control of shipping in the Straits of Hormuz. It's going to have to negotiate that with Iran, and Iran has a lot of leverage. It's going to have to reach an agreement on Iran's nuclear capabilities, which will, in my view, allow Iran to continue to enrich, but place real limits, along with IAEA inspections on what they're actually allowed to possess. And so, in a sense, we're going to be going back very much to something similar to the agreement that we reached before. But of course, that's now going to be done in a situation where the United States doesn't have the same kind of leverage, and it won't be as good a deal as we got. But I would tell President Trump to cut his losses, get the war over, and don't do something like this again.
Wouldn't that essentially, though, require Trump to admit that he was wrong? Is that something you see Trump doing?
Well, he won't ever admit he was wrong, but if there's any American president who's been good at backtracking, at reversing course and getting people to go along with him, even if what he's doing is an obvious retreat, it's Donald Trump. So no, he's not, in most cases, willing to admit error. Here, I think he'll pretend it's a victory and hope everybody can get distracted by his next outrageous activity.
And so you mentioned other US presidents there. I suppose a question I have is, does this war on Iran, does it fit into a broader pattern in how the US uses military force? Or is it a one-off, a particular situation driven by this particular president in this particular moment?
Well, I think it's actually consistent with some past mistakes we have made, most notably the war with Iraq, but you could also add the long war in Afghanistan, which ultimately ended badly. And I'd make the broader point that this is another example of how aggressive wars are increasingly pointless. They don't seem to accomplish what their initiators are trying to achieve. That was true when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. It was true when Russia invaded Ukraine. It's true for us in a number of different cases, and it's even true in some civil wars like in Sudan or in Libya, that given the nature of modern warfare, the power of national resistance, the changing nature of military technology, it's becoming increasingly difficult for even powerful states to impose their will on others and come out of it actually ahead. I think the lesson here is that actually staying out of wars is the way that countries benefit. And I think if you look at how China has acted over the last 30 or 40 years, staying out of wars has been a great benefit to them. It's a lesson the rest of us might want to take more seriously.
So soft power, not hard power, not exactly Donald Trump's personal strength.
Hard power is still important, but it needs to be used very sparingly and to defend interests, not to try and attack, conquer, and dominate others.
Stephen Walt, thank you so much for joining us.